Ilustres convidados, senhoras e senhores, sejam então muito bem-vindos. Vamos dar início ao primeiro Seminário Internacional do Segundo Relatório do Desenvolvimento e Coesão. Nesta sessão, debateremos as tendências recentes e os desafios da convergência externa e interna de Portugal e contamos, naturalmente e desde já, com a vossa participação, com a participação de todos. Para abrir a sessão, convido a Presidente da Agência para o Desenvolvimento e Coesão, Cláudia Joaquim, por favor.
Excelentíssima Senhora Ministra da Presidência, Mariana Vieira da Silva, Excelentíssima Senhora Ministra da Coesão Territorial, Ana Brunhosa, Excelentíssimo Senhor Diretor de Política da DG Régio, Peter Berkowitz, Excelentíssima Senhora Diretora para o Desenvolvimento Regional e Governança Multinível, Europeia, Allain-Dupré, e Excelentíssimo Senhor Presidente do Grupo de Alto Nível sobre o Futuro da Política de Coesão, Professor Andrés Rodríguez-Pose. É com muito gosto que vos recebemos no Instituto Superior de Ciências Sociais e Políticas, a quem agradecemos o acolhimento deste seminário para dar início aos trabalhos relativos à segunda edição do Relatório do Desenvolvimento e Coesão, produzido pela Agência para o Desenvolvimento e Coesão no cumprimento da sua missão, enquanto organismo responsável pela coordenação da Política de Desenvolvimento Regional. Aproveito igualmente para agradecer a disponibilidade da Senhora Comissária Europeia da Coesão e Reformas, que, não podendo estar fisicamente connosco, não deixou de se associar a este novo evento, tendo partilhado um vídeo que poderão ver de seguida. A produção de estudos, a promoção de reflexão e do debate em torno dos temas mais relevantes para a política de desenvolvimento regional constituem uma das formas de responder à nossa missão, garantindo, em simultâneo, o envolvimento de um conjunto vasto de atores, como a academia, os diversos níveis de governo ou outros organismos da administração pública. O primeiro relatório do Desenvolvimento e Coesão foi elaborado entre 2016 e 2018 pela Unidade de Política Regional da Agência. O processo de elaboração permitiu aprofundar a discussão e a reflexão conjunta entre as dinâmicas e desafios do desenvolvimento regional em Portugal e o seu enquadramento no contexto internacional. Os temas abordados foram os processos de convergência económica nos territórios da União Europeia, a provisão de serviços sociais de interesse geral e coesão territorial em Portugal e a governança multinível e o quadro institucional português. O resultado deste trabalho foi relevante para dossiês em que participámos, desde a negociação do quadro regulamentar da política de coesão para o período 2021-27, ao desenho da Estratégia Portugal 2030, que enquadrou a programação e negociação do PRR e do Portugal 2030 e constitui igualmente um contributo para a articulação entre níveis de governo cada vez mais relevante num contexto de aprofundamento das competências a nível regional e local. No seguimento da sua primeira edição, o trabalho que estamos a iniciar para a elaboração da segunda edição do Relatório do Desenvolvimento e Coesão compreende três grandes áreas do desenvolvimento e coesão, que são, nomeadamente, processos de convergência e divergência nacionais e regionais, posicionamento das regiões portuguesas na dupla transição climática e digital e estruturação da governança multinível como fator sine qua non para enfrentar os desafios futuros. A par destes três grandes temas, os nossos trabalhos vão igualmente ter em consideração, de forma transversal, as questões ligadas aos desafios demográficos que o país enfrenta. Estes temas, para além de enquadrarem alguns desafios mais importantes que Portugal terá no horizonte desta década, e que tem uma associação direta às 4 agendas temáticas nas quais assenta a Estratégia Portugal 2030, destacaria a Agenda 4, um país competitivo externamente e coeso internamente, e permitirão igualmente contribuir para a definição de política de desenvolvimento regional do país e para as tomadas de decisão e posicionamento do Estado português no âmbito da discussão das bases para uma eventual reconfiguração da política de coesão pós-27. A elaboração do segundo relatório surge, assim, num momento particularmente oportuno. Ao mesmo tempo que foi iniciado o debate sobre o futuro da política de coesão, com base na criação do grupo de alto nível presidido pelo professor Andrés Rodríguez-Pose, que nos dá a honra de poder estar hoje aqui conosco, assiste-se em Portugal a um interesse renovado pelas temáticas de desenvolvimento regional, nomeadamente no quadro das recentes reformas na área da descentralização para os municípios e da desconcentração reforçada para as comissões de coordenação e desenvolvimento regional. No contexto da elaboração da segunda edição do Relatório Desenvolvimento e Coesão, a Agência para o Desenvolvimento e Coesão continua a sublinhar a importância do envolvimento dos diversos atores para uma discussão participada, aberta e informada sobre os temas em que se propõe trabalhar. Assim, além dos seminários internacionais, gostaria de destacar outras iniciativas, como sejam as visitas de campo aos territórios para melhor compreender os desafios que se colocam aos diferentes atores às diversas escalas, a animação da rede de dinâmicas regionais prevista no modelo de governação do Portugal 2030 e a promoção do envolvimento da academia, para a qual será lançado um concurso do Programa de Assistência Técnica nas próximas semanas, com o objetivo de apoiar estudos de investigação sobre os 3 temas que nos propomos tratar no relatório. Deste modo, o primeiro seminário que hoje realizamos é subordinado ao tema Convergência Económica Regional, Tendências Recentes e Desafios na Convergência Externa e Interna de Portugal, que permite debater os processos de convergências e divergências nacionais e regionais, enquanto um dos temas a tratar no relatório. Este tema assume particular relevância nas discussões sobre o desenvolvimento regional à escala europeia e nacional. O nosso primeiro painel, que conta com a participação da Comissão Europeia e da OCDE, além do professor Andrés Rodríguez-Pose, incide sobre as principais tendências europeias e internacionais sobre os processos de convergência ao nível nacional e regional. O segundo painel promove uma discussão mais dedicada em torno do caso português, que é um caso quase singular à escala europeia, marcado por um processo pouco reconhecido de convergência interna, ainda que tal decorra, em grande medida da desaceleração do crescimento das 2 áreas metropolitanas. Resta-me, por último, agradecer à Unidade Política Regional e ao Núcleo de Comunicação e Documentação a preparação deste seminário e desejar-vos um dia intenso de trabalho em torno de um debate informado sobre as trajetórias de convergência. Obrigada e bom trabalho.
Muito obrigado, Sra. Presidente Cláudia Joaquim. E tal como referiu na sua sessão de abertura, vamos ter a oportunidade de ver e ouvir a mensagem que a Sra. Comissária Europeia para a Coesão e Reformas, Elisa Ferreira, fez questão de gravar para este seminário. Chamo, portanto, a vossa atenção. Vamos olhar para os ecrãs, por favor.
Senhora Ministra da Presidência, cara Mariana Vieira da Silva, Senhora Ministra da Coesão, cara Ana Abrunhosa, Senhora Presidente e Senhor Vice-presidente da Agência de Desenvolvimento e Coesão, Cláudia, Joaquim e Duarte Rodrigues, caras e caros participantes. Eu lamento sinceramente não poder estar convosco neste seminário internacional, que é tão importante sobre desenvolvimento e coesão, mas de facto os compromissos que tinha anteriormente assumido impedem-me de aí estar. Mas não quero deixar de me associar ao evento, até porque os debates anunciados são atuais, são importantes, são necessários. De facto, todos temos consciência dos desafios dos tempos em que vivemos. As crises que enfrentamos sucedem-se a uma velocidade vertiginosa e assumem contornos que ainda há pouco tempo nós considerávamos impensáveis, desde a pandemia do Covid-19, depois a guerra da Ucrânia, as ondas de choque provocadas, um realinhamento geopolítico internacional, uma crise energética de grande complexidade, para além, evidentemente, dos custos humanos. Em pano de fundo, assistimos ao envelhecimento acelerado da Europa, uma perda demográfica muito marcante, à urgência de incorporar as consequências das emergências climática e energética, o que nos obriga a repensar tudo aquilo que fazemos e como fazemos, a digitalização da economia com todas as suas consequências e ao sentimento de incerteza e insegurança que também por estes motivos todos graça entre muitos cidadãos. E este tipo de sentimento tem levado muitos a questionar a eficácia, a confiança nas instituições e mesmo os valores de base que sustentam as nossas sociedades e também os nossos objetivos de prosperidade. Mas valores como o pluralismo, o Estado de Direito, a democracia, enfim, vários estudos demonstram também que o sentimento real ou percebido de abandono entre os cidadãos europeus, nomeadamente é resultado de uma globalização que se lhes apresenta como descontrolada, apresenta uma forte correlação com manifestações várias de distanciamento e até protesto em relação àquilo que nós vulgarmente chamamos como sistema. Mesmo que as agendas preconizadas pelos críticos, isto é, as alternativas, não sejam verdadeiras alternativas, não seja uma solução, mas o protesto acaba por estar no centro da agenda política. Ora, uma parte da resposta a estas ansiedades, a estas incertezas, assenta também num reforço efetivo das condições de vida, o que quer dizer coesão social e territorial, as condições efetivas de vida dos cidadãos. Mesmo que os desafios sejam globais, o seu impacto faz sentir localmente, no dia-a-dia de cada cidadão, de cada localidade, de cada região, porque a economia e a sociedade, de facto, não funcionam em abstrato, elas funcionam no terreno. E é por isso também que a política de coesão é tão essencial para não só contrariar as tendências naturais de divergência que são geradas pelo funcionamento da economia, pelo mercado, pelas livres circulações, de facto não há mecanismos automáticos de reequilíbrio, como também para atenuar o impacto assimétrico das crises e, de forma mais estrutural, reequilibrar o crescimento económico na totalidade das sociedades e dos territórios, até mais do que o crescimento, é o desenvolvimento num sentido mais amplo da palavra. E é para esse objetivo que nós trabalhamos diariamente. E a política de coesão, sendo a maior política de investimento da União Europeia, representa, como se sabe, apenas 1/3 do orçamento europeu. Digo apenas porque o orçamento é muito pequeno, como se sabe. Mas em Portugal e em cada um dos países, mas em Portugal estes apoios, também é sabido, ultrapassam os 23 mil milhões de euros até ao final da década. E também, como sabemos, juntam-se os valores correspondentes ao cofinanciamento nacional, público e privado. Não estamos aqui a falar do PRR, que é um extra transitório que se lhe acrescenta também. Mas os fundos e os programas da política de coesão, e às vezes esquecemos isto, embora seja óbvio, não são um fim em si mesmos. São instrumentos para alcançar um objetivo, para concretizar uma ambição. E essa ambição tem de ser clara, a de acelerar e atingir um desenvolvimento territorialmente equilibrado e harmonioso também dentro do país. A política essa tem de ser definida coletivamente, envolvendo os distintos níveis de governação, o nível de governação europeu, o nacional, o regional, o local, na definição do tipo de sociedade que se quer deixar para as próximas gerações e a forma de lá chegar, os detalhes da forma de lá chegar. Os acordos de parceria que definem as estratégias de desenvolvimento a apoiar pela política de coesão neste novo período de 21-27 e os programas nacionais, regionais e temáticos que as concretizam no terreno são, de facto, o modo como nós tentamos atingir esse objetivo. E estamos em pleno momento de implementação desses instrumentos. Não há tempo a perder. Mas tão ou mais importante do que a rapidez, a celeridade, que é muito importante, é a qualidade das estratégias, a qualidade na definição das prioridades, nas escolhas, nos próprios projetos. Mas é também tempo de olhar para o futuro. As mudanças nas nossas economias e sociedades são de tal forma rápidas que é preciso que repensemos de alguma forma todos juntos a eficácia dos instrumentos e dos procedimentos desta política, desta velha e central política de coesão. Com a publicação do 8º Relatório da Coesão há cerca de um ano, a Comissão Europeia deu início a uma reflexão sobre a política de coesão pós-2027, no fim deste período. O que é que nós aprendemos? E esse relatório mostra claramente que a política de coesão tem feito jus ao título que lhe é regularmente atribuído até por instituições externas, como é o Banco Mundial. É um motor de convergência. Mas o relatório mostra, igualmente, o desafio que se coloca, nomeadamente quanto às regiões que estagnaram num nível de desenvolvimento totalmente insuficiente ou que entraram em declínio evidente. No que diz respeito a Portugal, assim como em muitos outros países, Portugal tem apenas, ao fim destes anos todos de apoio, a área metropolitana de Lisboa com um produto interno bruto por habitante em PPS próximo da média da União Europeia, embora esteja em declínio. O Algarve e a Madeira oscilam em torno dos 75%, com variações também, obviamente, da média europeia, mas em todas as outras regiões, que no fundo é a maioria da população do país, o PIB per capita é inferior ou igual à média da União, 70% da média da União. Portanto, um valor extraordinariamente baixo. Classifica todo o resto do país como regiões atrasadas, nem sequer em transição. O Norte e o Centro, apesar de apresentarem taxas de crescimento superiores à média europeia, nem por isso estão a conseguir sair daquilo que nós chamamos a verdadeira armadilha da estagnação, num nível de rendimento que, como disse há pouco, as classifica como regiões atrasadas, portanto inferior a 75%, mesmo inferior a 70%. Igualmente preocupante é, naturalmente, o facto de, com exceção de Lisboa e do Algarve, todas as regiões portuguesas estarem a perder população. No recente relatório da Comissão Europeia, a que intitulamos em inglês Harnessing Talent in European Regions, portanto a tradução, enfim, é um pouco difícil, mas o Alentejo destaca-se enquanto região estruturalmente afetada por uma perda histórica de população jovem e qualificada. Portanto, é uma região que a perdeu. Mas, por exemplo, o Norte sobressai no contexto europeu com uma preocupante perda, uma saída de população qualificada em idade ativa. É por isso urgente desenvolver estratégias nacionais e regionais que possam reverter estas distintas situações, sabendo nós que não há solução de tamanho único. Nem me compete a mim, nas atuais funções, estar a prescrevê-las. No entanto, há traços comuns nos modelos e regiões mais bem-sucedidos na Europa que apontam para aspectos como a incorporação de mais inovação na economia, através de mais e melhores ligações entre os centros de inovação e as empresas, e aqui os centros urbanos têm também, as universidades, etc., têm uma função muito importante, uma sempre melhor qualificação dos trabalhadores no quadro de estratégias regionais que sejam de facto capazes de potenciar as vantagens comparativas de cada território, incluindo aqui a qualidade das instituições, cada dia é mais importante, e aqui em instituições estou também a englobar os diferentes níveis da administração pública, mas também o grau de descentralização de algumas políticas. Um outro estudo recente, o Índice de Competitividade Regional, que foi recentemente publicado, mostra claramente que os países com menores assimetrias internas e com uma multipolaridade em termos de polos de desenvolvimento são precisamente aqueles que registram o melhor desempenho económico e tecnológico até. A diversidade de fontes de competitividade setorial e regional permite aumentar aquilo que hoje se chama a resiliência do todo. O Índice de Competitividade Regional mostra também que as regiões menos competitivas têm uma grande dificuldade em quebrar o círculo vicioso da fraca competitividade, fraco crescimento. Todavia, não é impossível, e vê-se progressos nessa dimensão estrita, em termos de progressivo relançamento da competitividade em regiões como Śląskie, na Polónia, ou mesmo o norte de Portugal, duas das regiões que têm conseguido progredir nos últimos anos em termos deste indicador de competitividade. Estes ganhos precisam de ser consolidados, precisam de ser aprofundados, precisam de ser estudados e alargados a mais regiões. As experiências positivas de umas podem inspirar e ensinar outras. Encontrar formas de responder melhor aos desafios estruturais, promover a inovação e melhorar a competitividade ao mesmo tempo também que aumentarmos os níveis, os índices de bem-estar e de equidade, é o objetivo a que nos propomos e que esta conferência e outras que seguirão procurarão mais concretamente dar resposta em termos de como se podem melhorar de facto estes instrumentos e a utilização destes fundos excepcionais disponíveis. Durante o ano de 2023 vamos ouvir sugestões, vamos ouvir propostas. Reunimos um grupo de alto nível com académicos, com pessoas com experiência. Mensalmente este grupo promove reflexões e debates e eles podem ser seguidos online e eu aproveito para vos convidar a seguirem-nos. E nós esperamos que, ao preparar o 9º relatório da Coesão, possamos já beneficiar dos contributos de toda a comunidade interessada numa política de coesão. Política esta que, apesar de inquestionável, terá de se ajustar às circunstâncias, terá de melhorar sempre e explorar todas as margens de progresso possíveis. Neste momento, resta-me desejar-vos um excelente dia de debates e fico a aguardar as ideias que, estou segura, virão desse vosso debate. Estamos abertos ao diálogo, estamos à escuta e, portanto, muito obrigada pelo vosso tempo, pela vossa capacidade de trazer novas ideias e ideias construtivas a esta política que nós todos reconhecemos que é absolutamente essencial à vida da União Europeia. Muito obrigada.
Um agradecimento especial à senhora Comissária Elisa Ferreira, que nos honrou nesta sessão de abertura através desta mensagem gravada. Diria, e se me permitem, uma autêntica oração de sapiência. E para encerrar esta sessão de abertura, convido a usar da palavra a senhora Ministra da Presidência, Mariana Vieira da Silva.
Muito bom dia a todos. Queria cumprimentar naturalmente o nosso anfitrião, o Sr. Presidente do ISCSP, também o Diretor de Política da DG Régio, Peter Berkowitz, o Excelentíssimo Sr. Presidente do Grupo de Alto Nível sobre o futuro da política de coesão, a Sra. Diretora para o Desenvolvimento Regional e Governança Multinível, naturalmente toda a AD&C aqui em peso, também nas pessoas da sua Presidente e do seu Vice-presidente, Sra. Ministra da Coesão Territorial, muito bom dia. É um gosto estar aqui hoje a fazer uma das discussões mais relevantes que nós temos que fazer nos próximos tempos. Portugal tem tido, ao longo dos últimos anos, crescimentos do PIB superiores à média europeia. Entre 2015 e 2022, Portugal registrou um crescimento médio anual 5 vezes superior ao registado entre 99 e 2015 e temos, desde 2016, e com exceção do ano da pandemia, convergido com a União Europeia. E estes indicadores são acompanhados de outros sobre o crescimento do investimento, o crescimento das exportações, e também sobre o crescimento do emprego, muito significativo, mas também sobre alguns dos atrasos estruturais que marcam os anos recentes do nosso país, como são, exemplo, o abandono escolar precoce ou a taxa de alunos no ensino superior. A verdade é que estas melhorias, muito significativas, tanto em indicadores de conjuntura como de indicadores estruturais, não se têm traduzido na convergência do país medida pelo PIB per capita em paridade de poder de compra. E não se tem traduzido na correção que desejávamos das desigualdades territoriais que o nosso país tem. E é por isso muito importante, no momento em que iniciamos a execução do Portugal 2030, em que estamos a fazer a discussão sobre a reprogramação do Programa de Recuperação e Resiliência e em que estamos mais ou menos a meio do caminho de um conjunto de estratégias que tínhamos definido, é muito importante olhar para este problema e revisitar a estratégia que tínhamos definido em função do caminho que queremos fazer. As causas para esta dicotomia entre a melhoria dos indicadores medidos a nível nacional e a convergência externa que temos conseguido e os indicadores que ainda não alcançámos do ponto de vista também da coesão territorial merecem ser debatidas, é por isso que fazemos este debate e outros debates que estamos a fazer neste momento, sempre com este objetivo de que o reforço do processo de convergência externa que temos procurado e que estamos a atingir só faz sentido se ele se transformar não só numa melhoria da vida dos nossos cidadãos, ou seja, garantindo a coesão social, como também garantindo a coesão territorial. Portugal definiu, quando nos preparávamos para olhar para este grande pacote de financiamento europeu, a que há pouco a Comissária Elisa Ferreira se referia, uma estratégia, uma visão de médio prazo que tinha como objetivo principal recuperar a nossa economia, proteger o nosso emprego e fazer com que a próxima década fosse um período de recuperação e de convergência do nosso país com a União Europeia. E essa estratégia, de que falamos menos, por termos um debate do dia-a-dia muito marcado por outro tipo de abordagem aos fundos europeus, nomeadamente a do ritmo da execução, mas essa estratégia tem uma importância transversal na nossa definição de políticas públicas, tanto no que diz respeito à forma como se organiza, por exemplo, o programa de governo, como no que diz respeito à forma como nós utilizamos os fundos que temos à nossa disposição, tanto o Programa de Recuperação e Resiliência como o PRR, como o PT 2030. A primeira prioridade era, por isso, olhar para os desafios demográficos e para os desafios das desigualdades e procurar um conjunto de políticas que nos permitissem responder a esses desafios. E no conjunto do Programa de Recuperação e Resiliência e do PT 2030, nós mais que triplicamos os recursos dedicados precisamente a estas áreas, à demografia, à inclusão e às desigualdades. E reforçamos em cerca de 26% as verbas para qualificar os recursos humanos. E isto significa olhar para estas dimensões da demografia, das desigualdades e, nomeadamente, para o envelhecimento demográfico dos nossos territórios, procurando garantir que temos condições para fixar os mais jovens, tanto do ponto de vista do emprego e dos salários, como do ponto de vista da habitação, e que temos políticas sociais capazes de fazer o caminho de transformação que a economia portuguesa tem vindo a fazer, sem deixar ninguém para trás. O segundo desafio é o que diz respeito à digitalização, à inovação e às qualificações como motores de desenvolvimento. Não há nenhum indicador em que Portugal tenha sido mais bem sucedido no caminho, na história recente. Nós atingimos as metas que pareciam praticamente impossíveis quando as definimos para 2020, tanto no que diz respeito à redução do abandono escolar como à taxa de escolarização no ensino superior, e isso significa que, por todo o país, com uma estratégia de rede muito fina na área das qualificações, temos conseguido fazer a transformação que tínhamos que fazer. Mas há um desafio muito importante num país com déficit histórico das suas qualificações, que é o da qualificação de adultos, com metas definidas a nível europeu muitíssimo exigentes, que vão obrigar a uma revisão muito forte da forma como nós olhamos para a educação de adultos, porque para atingir termos 60% dos adultos em cada ano a ter pelo menos um momento de formação profissional ou de educação mais formal, significam um grande esforço e, por isso, temos nesta área, tanto no programa de recuperação, tanto no PRR como no PT 2030, um fortíssimo desafio à nossa frente. A outra dimensão que queria destacar é a que diz respeito às nossas empresas. Sabemos que é preciso fazer mais para melhorar o acesso a financiamento das nossas empresas e para fazer aquilo a que a Comissária ali referia e que é talvez o ponto mais central, tanto do PRR como do PT 2030, garantir uma ligação entre o nosso sistema de inovação, entre o nosso sistema científico e tecnológico nacional e as nossas empresas, tendo nas agendas mobilizadoras agora reforçadas, o financiamento mais simbólico daquilo que procuramos no nosso PRR nesta matéria. Também, no que diz respeito à transição climática e à sustentabilidade dos nossos recursos, Portugal tem feito especialmente na área da energia, um caminho precursor dos desafios que a Europa agora tem pela frente, com muitos anos, e isto também nos deve fazer pensar, em que foram questionadas as opções, nomeadamente de utilização de fundos comunitários, numa área então, vanguarda, em que muitos questionaram a sua importância real na transformação da nossa economia, e aqui estamos, hoje, em 2023, em que, no máximo, a crítica que ouvimos é que devíamos ter ido mais depressa. É uma tendência habitual no nosso país, primeiro questionar os objetivos e depois, quando olhamos para trás e afinal eles foram bem escolhidos, questionarmos se não poderíamos ter ido um pouco mais rápido. Mas tanto do ponto de vista das energias renováveis, como da economia circular, como de uma aposta significativa na mobilidade verde, em todos estes elementos temos procurado respostas. E por isso temos na Estratégia Portugal 2030 o conjunto de instrumentos de política e também o correspondente financiamento do lado dos fundos europeus para fazer face a algumas das receitas de sucesso que há pouco a Comissária Elisa Ferreira nos referiu. Porque é que este é o momento fundamental de fazermos este debate? Em primeiro lugar, porque temos, não é demais repetir, um conjunto de recursos incomparável com qualquer outro momento para utilizar, e tanto o PRR, na sua capacidade de resposta à crise da pandemia, mas entretanto às outras crises que surgiram, como o Portugal 2030, na sua resposta mais estrutural e na resposta estrutural que os fundos de coesão têm que dar, e por isso é o momento de termos certezas sobre a forma como vamos utilizar este financiamento. Mas também é um momento fundamental para fazermos este debate, porque estamos no nosso país, neste momento, e está aqui a minha colega Ministra da Coesão Territorial, um desafio fortíssimo no que diz respeito à organização administrativa, tanto na descentralização, com a descentralização para as autarquias de muitas áreas que até aqui estavam apenas concentradas na administração central, como no processo de reforço das CCDRs e de reforço das regiões. E por isso, a forma como nós vamos aplicar esta estratégia, aplicar estes fundos europeus no nosso território, dá uma importância fundamental ao debate que aqui hoje fazemos, porque entramos num momento diferente da nossa governação entre os diferentes níveis, que nos obrigará a refletir sobre quais são os melhores mecanismos de contratualização entre a administração central, as regiões e as autarquias, para que todos, utilizando os recursos que cada um tem disponíveis e em função das suas competências, possamos contribuir para cumprir os objetivos que definimos na Estratégia de Portugal 2030, mas também para saber pensar sobre ela, revê-la, dar-lhes outros instrumentos em função da forma como o mundo vai mudando, sempre muito mais depressa do que nós prevíamos. E, portanto, tanto pelo contexto europeu e mundial que vivemos, nesta espécie de permanente crise que vai variando as suas características, como pelas reformas que estamos a fazer do lado da nossa administração, no sentido da descentralização e do reforço das regiões, e também no que diz respeito aos recursos que temos à nossa disposição, este é mesmo um momento fundamental para percebermos se a estratégia que definimos e se a forma como alocamos os recursos a essa estratégia conduz realmente aos objetivos que aqui tratamos, de garantir que o desenvolvimento e a convergência com a União Europeia é forte, mas que, além disso, chega a todos, não deixa ninguém para trás e tem um efeito de promoção da coesão territorial. É também importante, e agora fora do nosso plano mais nacional, por termos a Comissão Europeia a fazer agora o debate sobre o futuro das políticas de coesão, e para que Portugal possa contribuir para esse debate, fazendo também a sua reflexão e sendo um dos países a quem mais se dirigem estes desafios das diferentes armadilhas de crescimento. Precisamos de contribuir para essa reflexão com o estudo sobre a nossa realidade, com a produção de mais informação, porque teremos necessariamente de olhar neste contexto de descentralização e de fortalecimento dos poderes das regiões de outra forma, para sabermos como é que cada região vai contribuindo para o caminho que definimos para o país. Esta capacidade de, ao mesmo tempo, fazer a alocação destes recursos, executar bem, cumprir os nossos objetivos, atingir as metas, no momento em que estamos a transformar a forma como o próprio Estado se relaciona com os objetivos e com estas metas, na sua ligação entre a administração central, regiões e descentralização, é um desafio muitíssimo grande. Há toda uma aprendizagem na forma como nós nos relacionamos, como definimos os objetivos, como avaliamos enquanto dura a execução, a nossa capacidade de os cumprir, que muito depende da capacidade que as pessoas que estão nesta sala e, naturalmente, outras que não estão, que há muitos anos estudam este tema, têm de inovar nas respostas e de conseguir fazer a reflexão nos momentos-chave e não, como às vezes acontece no nosso país, só depois das decisões tomadas e só depois do debate se fazer. Desejo, por isso, a todos um muito bom debate. Tenho muita pena de não poder ficar convosco, mas as obrigações são isso mesmo. Estou certa que me chegarão as melhores conclusões deste dia. Muito bom trabalho.
Obrigado, Sra. Ministra da Presidência, Mariana Vieira da Silva. Vamos então dar início aos debates, à primeira sessão deste programa, subordinado ao tema Processos de Convergência Regional, Perspectiva Internacional, que será seguida de debate. Será então esta sessão moderada por Duarte Rodrigues, Vice-presidente da Agência para o Desenvolvimento e Coesão, a quem peço, por favor, para subir ao palco. Convido também para subirem ao palco o keynote speaker Andrés Rodríguez-Pose, da London School of Economics, e os convidados Peter Berkowitz, da Direção-Geral da Política Regional e Urbana da Comissão Europeia, e também Dorothée Allain-Dupré, da Regional Development and Multi-Level Governance Division da OCDE. Sejam bem-vindos e passo então, dentro de instantes, a palavra a Duarte Rodrigues, que, tal como eu referi há instantes, vai moderar a primeira sessão, subordinada à temática Processos de Convergência Regional, Perspectiva Internacional. Por favor.
Good morning to everyone, and thank you very much our distinguished guests to be with us. So Andrés, thank you very much, Dorothée and Peter. I will be brief in this introduction because I think that the speech from the Minister, the Commissioner, our President are quite clear on the timing of this debate. We are in a turning point in what concerns the programming, the negotiation of EU funds. So the strategy, the RRP, the Portugal 2030, the partnership agreement. Now it's the stage of implementation. It's not an easy one for sure, and it's where we can achieve or not our common goals. We are in the process of decentralization that is quite relevant for this conversation. And we are also in the process, because that's how the life it is, we are closing the Portugal 2020, we are launching the Portugal 2030, and we are starting to discuss the Portugal, let's call by now 2040. So we are also at European level starting the debate on what will be the cohesion policies after 27 or 29, whatever will be the date. And that's why this debate is so relevant. Over the morning, we'll have a global perspective, so we'll look from Portugal from outside, if I can say like that, while in the afternoon we have a more in-depth debate on base of the Portuguese case. So I will stop here and ask my colleague Andrés, thank you very much for being with us, to have a kick-off presentation. And the idea is that after Peter and Dorothée can give some comments and we open the discussion. Haverá tradução e, portanto, estejam à vontade para as perguntas em português, em inglês, como assim preferirem. Andrés, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Duarte, for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to be in such a nice city like Lisbon. Dear Minister, dear colleagues, dear friends, it's very difficult to follow the act of having Commissioner Ferreira and Minister Vieira da Silva highlighting what the problems and what the issues are. They both put together and they both indicated one big word that came in both presentations, which was desafios, challenges. And what I'm going to try to highlight is from a European perspective, what are the challenges that we're facing in terms of regional development, in terms of convergence and greater cohesion, and try to measure those challenges from a different perspective. I'm going to be introducing a new term, which is the development trap, looking at why so many parts of Europe have stagnated. First, why do we need to measure this? How do we measure it? Where is this development trap more pervasive? And what are the consequences for policy in order to make sure that we address not just the problem of the least developed regions, the lagging behind regions, but also of the many places in Europe that are falling behind, that once were prosperous and are now far less prosperous, as Commissioner Ferreira highlighted. So we can put the first slide, please.
It's not working.
Oh, is that not working? Oh, yeah, there it is. So I'm going to start with highlighting the problem. More than the problem is the desafio, the challenge. What is the challenge? And this is a map of the world, and it's a very ambitious project. I think it's probably the most ambitious project ever launched, done by McKinsey Global Institute, and I was one of the advisors in the whole process, in which is trying to look at levels of economic growth, in this case in GDP per capita, across the whole world at a very fine scale, going from the traditional national scale that we normally have to the subnational scale all over the globe over the last 20 years using night lights captured by satellite. And what you have there is, well, if you can put here, for example, anything that's in blue is levels of growth of more than 3% per annum per capita over the period between 1990, and I'm just going to move it a bit just to make sure that there's no echo, between 2000 and 2020. And you can see that many parts of the world have caught up. Most of China, parts of North Kazakhstan have grown at levels of above 8% per annum per capita. Places like most of India, with differences, the growth has been at levels of about 3% or higher. Whereas if we go to Europe, what we have is that the blue colors become increasingly green and ochre and even brown or reddish. What you have here is that within Europe, if I can find it, the pointer here, in blue, you have many parts of Central and Eastern Europe. Poland, Baltic states, parts of Western Romania, parts of Slovakia, they have caught up significantly to the average. They have converged to the rest of Europe. The more we move to the west, what we start seeing is darker colors that become, in some cases, red or really ochre. What does this mean? That those darker colors that you see over here, these are places that today, well, not 2023, and in fact, many haven't recovered since the COVID crisis, but in 2020, had levels of GDP per capita that were lower than what they had 20 years ago. 2 decades of no growth. By no means Europe is in the worst situation. There are worse parts of the world. You have much more ochre colors around the Sahara in Africa, but also in Somalia, for example, Rhodesia, etc. But many parts of Europe are not growing. And you can see if you translate this map into here, anything that appears in black implies that these are parts of Europe that in 2020 had lower levels of development. than in 2000. What you find here, this is concentrated fundamentally in Greece, most of Italy, with very, very few exceptions, parts of the industrial belt in France around Paris. And if we go to Portugal, this is particularly worrying because it covers Lisbon, the region that is the biggest agglomeration in Portugal, the one that according to theory should be the motor of economic development in Portugal, and that hasn't performed well, and also parts of the Alentejo region. So this is a big challenge because we in Europe, we cherish our way of life, we cherish our social state, we cherish our welfare, but the question is, how can we actually maintain it? How can we remain competitive if many parts of our territory, and very often many of the parts that were the most dynamic in the past, don't manage to grow as they did before, and grow much less than many other parts of the world that are far more dynamic than we are. So these are probably regions, when we look at those regions that haven't grown for the best of 20 years, that are caught in what we can call a development trap. And the question is, what is a development trap? Well, I'm going to highlight where the concept comes from. About 15 to 17 years ago, 15 years ago in 2008, economist Gillian Carras proposed the concept of the middle income trap. They were looking at country level, and they realized that there were many countries that over time, starting from very low levels of development, had been growing very, very quickly until they reached a certain level of development and got stuck. And then they stopped. Whereas some countries managed to jump that level, others remain there. And the example that everyone puts is the case of South Korea versus Brazil. South Korea and Brazil in the late 1950s had the same levels of development of GDP per capita. Today, South Korea, we all know, is among the most developed countries in the world. Brazil is stuck since the 1960s at levels of development that are 23% of those that we find in the United States. In absolute terms, it has improved, but in relative terms, the gap has remained more or less stable. Is South Korea the norm and Brazil the exception? No, unfortunately, South Korea, Taiwan are the exceptions, Malaysia are the exceptions. The norm is the many countries in Latin America, in Africa, in many parts of South Asia, but also in many parts of Europe that caught up for a while and then remained stuck. And this was an issue that has been described at national level, but has been described at levels of development that are far lower than what we find on average in Europe. The traditional description of the middle income trap is that you grow until levels of $11,000 per head per year, or $15,000, depending on the authors, and then you become stuck, you don't move forward. Well, when we look at Europe, there are virtually no regions in Europe that are below $11,000 or $15,000. We're all above that. Yet, what we find is that many regions, many parts of Europe remain stuck at very low levels of development. They are caught in a development trap. So what we decided is, let's try to apply this concept of the middle income trap to regions in Europe and regions that are at higher levels of development than what has been decided, looking at this very uneven growth performance, far more dynamic in Eastern Europe than what we find, for example, in the old industrial regions of Europe, that this uneven performance could be a sign of different types of regions falling into trap. And the first thing we did, and when I say we, is because this is work that has been conducted together with colleagues at the LSE and under the support of the European Commission, with the support of the European Commission, so colleagues like Simone Marino, Michael Stolper, and Andreas Diemer, we divided regions in Europe into 3 categories according to their levels of development. What you have there is in blue, that line, is the growth performance of regions that are considered to be at low levels of development. The less developed regions of Europe, those regions that have a GDP per capita or had a GDP per capita at the beginning of the period of analysis, in this case 2000, that was at or below 75% of the average of the European Union. Many of these regions have grown significantly. So you have the medium here, which is around 3.5%. So they're catching up. These are the regions that were in blue before in the map from Central and Eastern Europe, reducing the distance to the European average. So poor regions seem to be doing relatively well. Yet, when we get to the middle-income regions, what are known as the transition regions, those that are at levels of development of between 75% and 100% of the average of the European Union, in which most of Portugal was for a long time, albeit now we heard the Commissioner, Ferreira, saying that many parts of Portugal are falling even below that threshold. Many of these regions have had levels of growth that are close to zero or slightly above zero over that period. They haven't been catching up. They are in a development trap, which would be similar to what has been described as the middle-income trap. But what happens to more developed regions, those that are above the average? The rich regions at levels of development here in green, between 100 and 125, or in orange, those that are above 125. Well, many of those are also not growing. The medium is around 1% per annum, which is far lower in terms of economic growth than would have been desirable. So we have possibly a problem of stagnation, lack of economic dynamism, that is reproduced fundamentally at medium, intermediate, high, and very high levels of development. So we have that problem. Now the question is, how do we measure it? And of course, what we had at dilemma is what sort of indicators. The traditional indicator that people use is just one, which is GDP per capita. But when you're measuring economic phenomena, when you focus just on GDP per capita, you might grow economically without creating employment, or even at the expense of generating employment. You might grow with more employment, but without increasing productivity. So we decided to include 3 dimensions that highlight economic dynamism, which are the 3 most important ones. We looked at GDP per capita. In other places in the world, like in the United States where we're doing this, we're looking at income. We looked at productivity, and we looked at employment. And we compare these 3 dimensions along 3 different axes. We compare how any region in Europe is doing in terms of GDP per capita, productivity, and employment relative to itself in the past. Are you growing more than you did in the past, or are you growing less? Are you accelerating, or are you decelerating? The second axis is comparing yourself to the rest of the country. So is any region in Portugal growing more or faster in those 3 dimensions than the rest of Portugal? Is any region, let's say, in Poland doing the same? And of course, in the European Union, I think it's important to introduce this dimension, which is the whole of the European Union. How are you performing? How's your region performing to the average, relative to the average of the European Union? We put all that together into complicated formula. I'm not going to go into this, but mainly that's to highlight that we have different indicators. We measure whether you're in a trap or not. We measure the intensity, we measure the length. So there are quite a few formula behind that in order to produce what is going to come here. The map of regions that are either caught in a development trap or at high risk of falling into a trap. And as I said, we have several dimensions. The first one is the risk. Are you in a trap? What is the risk of you being in a trap, and what happens? And this is a map that covers, and this is a dynamic index, but that covers the longest period we have done. Well, we have data since 1990, but we cannot include Central and Eastern Europe. So this is starting in 2001, because in order to calculate data for the development trap in 2001, we need data from 1991, for example, because we take 5-year averages. And what we find is that light colors, and this index goes from 0 to 1. 0 means no trap whatsoever. 1 is the maximum level of entrapment. 0.5 we arbitrarily describe as falling into a risk of being in a trap. And what we find, if you look at lighter colors, means that there's low level of entrapment. Where do lighter colors prevail? Well, they prevail mostly in Central and Eastern Europe. They do across most of the Baltics, especially in parts of rural Lithuania, but Lithuania, Latvia, and rural Estonia, many parts of Poland, eastern parts of the Czech Republic, most of Slovakia, many parts of Hungary, and also of Romania and Bulgaria. In the western part of Europe, low levels of entrapment is, for example, in Cork, in Ireland, and many parts of Portugal. But amazingly enough, not the ones that you would expect according to theory that would be the most dynamic. So the northeast of Portugal, Trás-os-Montes, for example, Viseu, they are areas that have had relatively low risk of entrapment in comparison to other parts of Europe. By contrast, what you find is that the darker colors, more than 0.7, are the areas of Europe where you have the biggest development or risk of entrapment. And they are concentrated in Greece, in the internal part of Croatia, the area known as Lika, many parts of Italy, especially in central Italy, in areas of Abruzzo and Umbria, for example, and most of the industrial area around Paris in France, all the way from Picardy through towards the east, towards Alsace. When you look at Portugal, and we focus on Portugal, the main issue is concentrated in Lisbon and the Lisbon metropolitan area, but also, in theory, the second motor of the economy, the metropolitan area of Porto, that has been caught in a trap, that has been stagnating for the best of 20 years. Of course, this is just the risk. Are you in a trap or are you not in a trap? What is the intensity of the trap? How big is this entrapment? And this is what we measure with the second index, which we call DT2. It came in the formula. But here, the panorama is somewhat different. Again, the colors, the darker the colors, the bigger the intensity of the entrapment. The lighter the colors, the yellows in this case, is low levels of entrapment. Low levels of entrapment are prevalent in Western Romania, in many parts of Slovakia, in Lithuania, Latvia, to a lesser extent in Estonia, in Cork. But if you go, let's say, again, here to the west, the yellows disappear. It's one part of the Alentejo that is closer to that, but there's virtually no yellow in Portugal. There's virtually no yellow in the Iberian Peninsula overall. There's virtually no yellow in the south of Europe, although the intensity of entrapment is far higher in Greece, parts of southern Italy, central Italy, even northern Italy around Milan, than it is in Spain or in Portugal, although in Portugal you have that blue dot there, also very close to Lisbon in the Valle do Tejo here. And this is a problem that affects not only declining countries. You have the most dynamic country in Europe, if I can get that. So there, in which high dynamism in Cork, high dynamism in Dublin, does not prevent the Midlands from actually falling into a trap. And then the third type of map is the number of years in a development trap. We take the first map, or the first indicator, because this is a dynamic indicator. We measure and put at risk of being in a trap arbitrarily at 0.5 in a scale up to 1, and say, how many years have you been above that score? How many years have you been either at risk of falling in a trap or in a trap? And this is for the period 2001-2019, a maximum of 19 years altogether. So we find that there's only one region in Europe, which surprisingly to me was the region of the province of Lugo in Spain, that hasn't been a single year in a trap in this whole period. That's the only one. But that is the exception. In fact, what you find is that, there's lower levels or relatively low levels of entrapment. Many regions in, for example, the eastern part of the Czech Republic or in Slovakia have had less than 5 years of entrapment, some parts of Germany as well. But what I'm worried about, and you should be worried about, is the dark red. That is that out of a maximum of 19 years, those regions have been 17 years or more in a development trap. Where are they concentrated? They're fundamentally, and this is what comes out very clearly, anywhere in France around Paris. So going west from Paris, going mainly to the east and the northeast of Paris, going south of Paris, Paris doing relatively well, the surrounding areas actually not doing well, stagnating, and this is the situation that leads to the type of discontent that we're seeing here. Many parts of southern France, parts of Italy, Croatia again, then you have in Trace, for example, you have some provinces in Spain, Valencia being the biggest in terms of economic development, and then you go to Portugal, and what do you have? Lisbon metropolitan area and the Vale do Tejo. So what should be the biggest agglomeration, what should be, according to theory, the motor of the Portuguese economy. So clearly, this is a problem that affects Portugal and affects Portugal in a different way, perhaps in a more dramatic way that it might affect other parts of Europe. This is a dynamic index. We have done calculations, so this can be done on a yearly basis. You can see how it changes. It's at NUTS 2 level over years. You have years in which levels of entrapment are much greater, like, for example, after the financial crisis. But Portugal, and this is interesting to see, if you compare and look at the Iberian Peninsula, now we're going to start in 1990, but you see it's not very different from Spain, and then from 2000 onwards, earlier than before, it starts. So it has been high levels of entrapment now for the best of 20 years, as we saw in the case of Lisbon. Of course, it varies from countries to countries, and it varies. So, for example, we took the case of Denmark here, in which in blue you have the capital region that had pretty bad years of entrapment following 2000, but most of the period has been far lower than, for example, Zealand, which is this island over here, or North Jutland, which is over here, that have been in a far higher level of entrapment. Or if you take the case of France, we take Île-de-France, which is this region, the region of Paris, that especially since the financial crisis has had a far lower level of entrapment than places like Lorraine, Picardy, that are in those dark red areas that we saw before, or even Rhône-Alpes, which is over here, which has a relative dynamic city in France, which is the second largest city in France, Lyon. And then there's another dimension that I think is important, that when you look at over different types of periods, the index is relatively consistent. That map is a variation of the map that I showed you before. This is from 2001 to 2008. We have only changed the scale in order to make it comparable to these other two maps. This is a shorter period, 2010 to 2018, and this is a much shorter period, 2015 to 2018. I want you to take a look at Portugal, because otherwise, and what you find in Portugal here is that, yes, Lisbon and its metropolitan area has been in a trap for the long period, but it was also for the shorter period. It hasn't recovered particularly well since the financial crisis. And if we take just a look at the period from 2015 to 2018, despite the fact that the country has started to recover, as was mentioned by the Minister Vieira just a moment ago, Lisbon has had a sluggish recovery in comparison to the rest of the country and to the rest of Europe and to itself in the past. So how can I, and that's finally, yes, mainly, I see that Duarte is saying I should finish. So this can happen at different levels of development. You can have in red, these are the poor regions that are, or lagging behind regions that are in a trap. You can have it in ochre colors. These are medium income regions that are in a somewhat of a trap. And then you can have it in green, which is regions that are relatively rich or rich in the European context that have had no dynamism. So what can we conclude? What are the key policy takeaways? And this is a preliminary. This is opening the debate in many ways. Well, the first thing is that in Europe, we have been concerned, and rightly so, I think, by lack of development, low levels of development. And much of the effort coming especially from what is the largest economic development policy in the world, which is the European cohesion policy, has focused, and rightly so, on the less developed regions of Europe. Having said that, the problem is far broader. We need to support the less developed regions of Europe, as has been done until now, but there are a lot of regions in Europe that are going nowhere, that are stagnant, that are trapped, and that have not moved forward. These are regions that are firing well below their potential. It's not that the potential in the north of Italy, it's not that the potential in Lorraine, in Picardy, it's not that the potential of Lisbon has disappeared overnight. There's talent, there are dynamic sectors, there's potential here that needs to be tapped into. Because otherwise, we are like an economy that is not firing on all cylinders. And if we only have one cylinder moving, we're going to move forward, but very, very slowly. And we want to move faster because the rest of the world is moving faster. So we need to take into account not just the static dimension, levels of development, but also the dynamic dimension in which this level of entrapment, the presence of a development trap, this level of stagnation should be considered and should be considered in policy. This is an important policy gap, and it should be put into motion. Why? Because the consequences of overlooking this level of entrapment are phenomenal. First, there's a pure economic consequence. If you have a high level of entrapment, what you're doing is you're not mobilizing, you're not harnessing, the word that was used by Commissioner Ferreira, the economic potential of all these regions. We want the European economy to be firing on all cylinders, not just to rely on the development of Paris that is not going to spread out and is not going to reach Portugal, is not going to reach the rest of France, whatever we do. But there are also, and this was also highlighted very clearly by Commissioner Ferreira, the social and political risks. In places where there's a high level of entrapment, these are places that are brewing discontent. And places that are brewing discontent are turning to political options at the extremes, anti-system options that offer what are on paper easy solutions, but in reality never work. I'm just going to give you one indicator. During the pandemic, democratic governments that were governed by populists had a 10-point higher excess mortality than democracies that were not governed by populists. Why? Because if your president tells you that COVID-19 is just a small flu and nothing happens, agrippina, or that you have to inject yourself with bleach and then you solve yourself, you don't find the right solutions. We need real solutions to prevent discontent. Because also, if you continue with that discontent, you end up like the country I work in, which is the UK, you end up with Brexit. That means that the places that were losing out, the places that were in a development trap lose out, the places that were not in a development trap lose out as well, and the rest, the whole of the country actually loses out. We are all worse off. And how do we go about this? We need to think about those policies. We need to put this concept into policies, and we need to try to implement policies that are adapted to the conditions of each place-based, or I would even say place-sensitive policies that would address this, would create and tap into the potential, and we'll make sure that the quality of life, the talent that we all have wherever we are in Europe is harnessed to maximal potential, and as a result of that, the well-being and the welfare of citizens of Europe, wherever they live, is not just preserved, but is enhanced. Thank you very much. There you go.
Thank you very much, Andrés. Now, Peter, between 15 and 20 minutes for
How much
comments.
did I do?
No, it's okay. It's okay. And then we'll have time for a debate.
Right.
Peter.
Well, thank you very much, Minister, colleagues, friends. Pleasure to be here. What I want to do very briefly, because this could go on for a very long time, is present some of the data behind the messages that my commissioner brought earlier today. And this is very much based on what we have done in the cohesion report, but also the European semester. I think a country report has landed on your desk And what's interesting about the European semester reports is it has a much stronger focus on disparities than in previous years. So what do I want to do today? I want to look at issues of growth, convergence, and disparities in Europe and Portugal, and try and put the Portuguese case very much in a European perspective. I'll address some of the explanations for weaknesses in growth. I won't say very much about development traps because you have had the best presentation possible on development traps. But I also want to look at competitiveness and a little bit at demography. So messages about the impact of cohesion policy in Portugal, and then some conclusions. Now, there are two other very, very important issues that are part of this discussion, which I won't touch on, which are the green and digital transitions. But this would be for another time. So what is the story about regional disparities in the EU? The red line at the top is regions. The blue line is member state convergence. And the story we see is a story we know well, which is that disparities fell very fast, faster at member state level than at regional level, until the crisis, at which point they stabilized. And then after a recovery, started falling again, and then there was COVID, and COVID had a big shock, and we're not quite sure what's going to happen now in the coming years. So this is the general story, but let's take another step and actually look at what is the nature of this convergence process. And on the left, what we have is we have a comparison with the blue line of three categories of region, the categories which we know very well, the less developed, the transition, and the more developed. And the story we see is one of growth of the category of less developed regions compared to the EU average, a slight decline in more developed regions, and also a decline in this middle gap, the transition regions. But, and this is a very, very important message that I want to bring across, is that if we look at absolute growth, that's to say measured by GDP, on the right, we see all regions are growing at the level of the categories, because we have the same lines here. So what we can talk about in Europe is a process of, in general, upward convergence. That is to say, regions are moving closer together, but they're also all moving upwards. But this is a generalization, and I think this is where the real policy issues come, because then if we look at the picture of growth over the 20 years we've just lived through, we see that within the story of each category of regions, we have big differences. So, for example, although real GDP per head has increased, we see that, for example, in the less developed regions, this is very much driven by what is happening in the Central and Eastern European member states. And indeed, in spite of the fact that less developed regions as a whole grew over this period, we saw, particularly in parts of Southern Europe, in Greece and Italy, GDP per head falling. And growth was also relatively low in the north of France and parts of Spain and Portugal, although it was positive. So we have a very, very varied picture, once we start looking at regional level, of what is a generally positive process. And this reflects as well varied dynamics in member states. And this is a graph which looks at the evolution of disparities over time in GDP per head and the direction. And the red is 2000 and the green is 2021. And you can see that across Europe, we have a lot of different situations. So, for example, regional disparities have decreased in Austria, Belgium, Germany, Finland, and Portugal, and the process driving this is that the less developed regions in the country were growing faster than the capital region. In Bulgaria or Romania, in contrast, we have disparities increasing, and this is because the capital region has been growing very, very fast, faster than the less developed regions, but the less developed regions are still growing, and indeed they're growing faster, most of them, than the EU average. Different situation in France or Greece. Here, internal disparities have increased because the growth of GDP per head in the least developed and transition regions was particularly low. And that was the phenomena that Andrés presented us. Lower than in the most developed regions of the country, but also lower than that of the EU. And now we come to Portugal. And this is a very classic analysis of convergence in Portugal. On the bottom axis, you have the GDP per head in 2010. So we see all the way on the right, we have Lisbon, the Lisbon region, and on the left we have north and central regions. And on the vertical axis, we have the growth rate. And this is what we would expect in general terms. We would expect the poorer regions in the top left corner to be growing more quickly, and the richer regions to be growing less quickly. But what is special about Portugal, when you do this type of analysis in comparison with other member states, is it's a very extreme case of this. And what do I mean by that? Number one, Portugal's growth rate has been below the EU average, and Lisbon has contracted from 121% of the EU average in 2006 to 96% in 2021. And I was trying to think about this, but I do not see another capital city in Europe which has had this trajectory. In addition, the fastest growing regions, North and Centre, are growing more slowly than most regions in Central and Eastern Europe. And this means that in the growth hierarchy in Europe, Portugal may be overtaken in the coming years by Poland, Hungary, and even Romania if concerted policy action is not taken. And I'll come back to this towards the end of my presentation. Now, this is the map of development traps. I don't want to say a great deal about this because Andres has already presented it, but I wanted to emphasize one point that he made, which is that there is the potential for development traps in all parts of Europe and at all levels of income. It's not something, as Andres, you said, it's not a middle income trap. It is a risk. It is a risk that occurs at low, middle, and high levels of income. The other point I wanted to make is that development traps are not destiny. We see across Europe exceptions. We see them in parts of trapped Europe, for example, in Greece. In the south of Italy, we see parts of Puglia, we see Salonika, we see Crete. We see certain parts, not the coast, but certain parts in Spain, which have been able to avoid, let's say, the bigger tendency around them. Now, the Commissioner mentioned the competitiveness, the regional competitiveness indicator, and I just wanted to show you a bit more. This is an indicator which is a very useful indicator. It brings together 68 different indicators of factors of competitiveness. It is broken down into 3 sub-indicators of a basic indicator, efficiency indicator, and innovation indicator. We have institutions, macroeconomic stability, infrastructure, health, basic education. In the basic indicator, we have higher education, labor market efficiency, and market size in the efficiency sub-index. And we have technological readiness, business sophistication, and innovation in the innovation sub-index. Now, this type of indicator is often used to do ranks because people like having lists of ranking. I find that less interesting. I find it more interesting as a kind of device to try and pick out how regions are performing compared to their peers. And this is what we have done here. This is the website of the Regional Competitiveness Indicator. It is something which you can go and look at for individual regions, compare regions with their peers, try and understand where the weaknesses are. Now, just to say, on the left, we have a spider web or cobweb diagram for continental Portugal. There, the smaller one is for the Azores and for Madeira. The dotted blue line is EU 100, so that's the EU average. The dark red line is Lisbon, and the other 4 are the other 4 continental regions. Now, I don't want to take up too much time, but I just wanted to say what are the messages that come from this. Now, we can always argue about the indicators, and this is perhaps more of a device to encourage more analysis. But from this analysis, it would suggest in terms of competitiveness, the main weaknesses are linked to market size, internationalization, with the exception of Lisbon. And this is unsurprising, small country on the periphery of Europe, in some respects overperforming, but if you compare it to its peers, you see that this is a weakness. Higher education and lifelong learning, certainly Lisbon as well, is underperforming as a capital if you were to compare it with capital peers. And what we see as the differentiators between regions, if you look to the, I don't know, I will try and use the pointer. No, I can't. But if you look to the top left-hand corner, you see innovation, and you can see that there is a big difference between the best performing and the least performing. So we see innovation as one of the main determinants, and possibly infrastructure, but to a much lesser degree. And we see a similar pattern for the Azores and Madeira, but of course much more accentuated given the problems of peripherality. One very, very interesting thing that comes out of this is that if you look at the rank of Portugal and its regions on the regional competitiveness indicator, it performs better than it does in GDP. If you look at it in terms of GDP, Portugal is in the bottom third. If you look at it in the regional competitiveness index, you see that it is closer to the middle. And I think this raises some interesting questions. It may be a problem of the indicator, but it may say something about the way in which some of the, let's say, the quality of Portugal's institutions are not being translated into economic growth, and to reflect a little bit on that. Demographic change, I just want to be very brief on this to say that this is obviously a contributor. You can see the impact in Portugal, in almost all regions. Natural change of population is strongly negative, one or two very small exceptions. And this is a reality. And I think that the message here is that Europe has to deal with the problem of shrinking. We can mitigate it. It's a bit like climate change. We have to mitigate it, but we also have to adapt to new demographic realities. And this is particularly true, and this was the communication that our commissioner mentioned on harnessing potential in relation to talent. Because we don't see only the emergence of development traps, we see the emergence of talent development traps. That is to say, places which are in a downward spiral in terms of education and learning, and they're affected by a sharp decline in workforce and a stagnating share of tertiary education. It's completely the opposite of what you need. If your workforce is shrinking, then you need to upgrade your human capital. And of course, also the problem of the outmigration of a younger cohort. So I think we have to once again reflect more on demographic change. And this is as part of regional policies. And this is a reflection for the future. Okay, very briefly, because I don't want to take up too much time. This is the result of our modeling impact on Portugal. It's compared to the baseline for 2014-2020. I just wanted to show it because it shows a number of things. The first thing is that it shows the importance of cohesion policy for Portugal. Now, I think that would be the first message. If you look at Portugal compared to Spain, Greece, and Italy, the dark green line is 2023 impact, the light blue line is 2033. It has the biggest impact in Portugal. Now, this is a question of volume, but it's also a question of the fabric of the economy in Portugal, and also the policy choices that have been made. And in that respect, we see that it's generally higher than in other Mediterranean countries, or southern countries, and equivalent to that in Central and Eastern Europe. So it's not only just what is going in from the European Union, but it's also what you're using it for, which is very, very significant. And the policy mix for the new period, I just wanted to say, is broadly aligned with the Mediterranean countries, but there's a higher focus on sustainable mobility, but less than in other cohesion fund countries. And I think one of the important points, and I think there from the Commission, we really welcome this, is that there is a stronger focus compared to the EU average and other cohesion countries on the investment in PO1, which is innovation and business, and PO4, which is essentially people. Because I think that, and Andrés may want to comment on this, seems to us to be the best way of future-proofing the economy. So, what are my conclusions? Some very brief conclusions. First of all, that Europe is on a path of overall upward convergence at the moment. It has slowed over time. And increasingly, many regions are being left out of this process. This is the development trap. A second important message is that there is no single spatial growth model in Europe, but many different situations. And there's not a continuum. I mean, there's not the right way of doing it and the wrong way of doing it. I think our view is that almost every member state has to find its own path in this. And in this respect, Portugal has been characterized by a process of internal convergence led by the economic contraction of the capital. And this is really pretty atypical in Europe. And even the fastest growing regions are growing more slowly than equivalent regions in many parts of Central and Eastern Europe. And this is closely linked to declining productivity. So, I mean, the obvious result is that there is a falling behind process. We see key factors as market size, internationalization, higher education, lifelong learning, which are creating a structural skills deficit, as well as innovation and demographic change. And this is the positive message, there is really a unique opportunity now with the combination of the injection of the new funds and the RRF, and this, I think your Europe Minister said at the start. I mean, you really need to reflect how to best use this. I think it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. There is not going to be this sort of transfer from the European Union in the future. And finally, and I just want to echo what was said before, it's very important that you contribute to the discussion on the future of cohesion policy, to build on the successes of recent years, particularly in less developed regions, but also in terms of your needs. Because I think the reflection that this takes us to is the need for a more differentiated policy. But if we are going to talk about a more differentiated policy, then we have to know more about the needs of the countries that make up the European Union. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. And that's also one objective of this session, to steer this debate. Your chart on where we put our bets in this programming period, and when you compare with the other clubs of countries, is quite similar to the previous one. So this raises against the debate between the mismatch on the inputs, the outputs on the index, and the GDP, but we'll leave for the debate. Duarte, the last but not the least, a perspective from OECD on this topic.
Thank you, Duarte. Dear participant, Minister, I'm very delighted to be part of this very important, interesting debate. So my presentation will echo some of the findings presented by Andrés and Peter. I will focus on the OECD perspective, starting by presenting the trends in regional inequalities in OECD countries, so going beyond the EU, United States, Canada, Australia, Japan, Korea, etc. Then zooming a little bit on the case of Portugal and mentioning some policy options moving forward to make the most of the place-based policy agenda. So let me start by highlighting some key trends in regional inequalities in OECD countries. So this is based on a forthcoming report that is not yet published, so you will have some preliminary insights before everybody. It will be published around the summer. So what we see is that across the OECD, we see a pretty clear picture. A convergence of income level between countries, but a divergence within countries. So the chart that you can see on the slide show the inequalities within countries at the level of TL2 and TL3, and the divergence is particularly clear at the level of small regions, what we call TL3 in the OECD typology, not 3 in the EU. So today, it's about 70% of the population living in OECD countries which experience increase of regional income inequality, polarization, and bottom-up region divergence in the past 20 years. This is often due to the top metropolitan region pulling ahead with an increasing gap with the lagging regions or those in development traps, as just mentioned by Andrés. And as you will see in a minute, and as was already mentioned by Peter, the situation of Portugal is actually quite different. So our next regional outlook also shows that the diverging trends within countries are not so old, in fact. There have been several decades of convergence between and within countries, but since the early 2000s, the deepening of the globalization did not create equal opportunities for all and triggered a change. And then the 2008 global financial crisis seems to have been a big turning point. The crisis has really generated a kind of split in OECD countries in terms of their regional income inequalities trajectories. And here you can see three, let's focus on maybe three main groups of countries. The first one, with the GDP per capita above OECD levels, have experienced a massive increase in regional income inequality. So this group includes, for example, the UK, France, Sweden, Denmark, and the US, and a massive particular increase has happened in the UK and the US. Another group with a GDP per capita also higher than the OECD average has experienced a decrease in regional income inequality. So this is the case of Japan, Germany, Finland, Norway, for example. And then a third group, which includes Portugal, have reduced regional inequalities, but at the same time diverge from the OECD mean in terms of GDP per capita. So, of course, the question is why? Why these different trajectories? So, from an economic perspective, the rise in regional income disparities is mainly explained by differences in productivity. In countries like the US, the UK, Sweden, labor productivity inequalities have kept increasing since the early 2000s. On the contrary, other countries like Portugal have experienced decreasing regional inequality in terms of labor productivity. But as I will explain, this might not be always for the right reasons. So, in a nutshell, the convergence machine in OECD countries seems to be broken, at least in a majority of them, for 70% of the population of OECD countries. So, while we cannot close all territorial gaps, for example, in income, it's important to focus on the disparities which can result in unequal outcomes. And for this, it's important to go beyond the GDP per capita, as mentioned by Andrés earlier. These are imperfect measures that do not take into account the inequalities in incomes and opportunities, nor the sustainability dimension. So our regional Outlook 2023 will attempt to provide a more comprehensive diagnosis. And the report looks at other factors such as access to services, sustainability, and demography. If we take the gaps in access to services, for instance, we know that these can be substantial, and they have been further highlighted by the pandemic. So this slide shows the urban-rural gaps in access to high-speed internet in OECD and G20 countries. And what we can see is that rural areas, the blue dot on the screen, are on average 31% points below the national average in terms of download speeds over fixed networks. So this has, of course, important consequences in terms of investment attraction, work opportunities in these areas more generally. These exemplify important inequalities in opportunities, which is what policymakers should focus on. And I could take similar examples in health or education, for example. Not fixing these problems can result in significant economic, social, political costs, and we are seeing how this cost can undermine our democracies today. The geography of this content, the revenge of places that do not matter, mentioned by Andrés, is making us all aware of the relevance of place-based policies, also mentioned by Commissioner Ferreira. So now, zooming on Portugal. The trend in Portugal has been a decrease in regional inequalities, but in a context of divergence, as I mentioned, from the OECD mean in terms of GDP per capita. I will focus maybe on 3 challenges for Portugal, which help explain this paradoxical situation. The challenge in productivity of urban regions, the demographic challenges, and the challenges of job opportunities of inner Portugal. So first, the productivity challenge. The main reason behind Portugal's decrease of territorial income inequalities is the decrease of labor productivity inequalities. And at first glance, this may sound like good news, but inequalities are also partly declining for, let's say, wrong reasons. Why? This is mainly, and this was mentioned by Peter and Andrés before, this is mainly because the 2 largest urban areas, Lisbon and Porto, are not leveraging their full potential as economic engines, especially compared to metropolitan areas in other OECD countries. We have released a report in 2020 on regionalization and decentralization in Portugal. And in this report, we highlighted that Lisbon, with a population of over 2.8 million in the agglomeration, in 2014, had lower levels of GDP per worker in 2014 compared to 10 other metropolitan areas with population of between 2 and 4 million people in the OECD, including, for example, Athens, Vienna, or Warsaw. Porto, with a population close to 1.3 million people, had lower productivity in 19 out of 20 cities with a population between 1 and 1.5 million, and was only outperformed by Thessaloniki in Greece. So out of 31 OECD countries with available data, Portugal was one of only 7 where GDP growth in the metropolitan areas was lower than the rest of the country between 2000 and 2016. So this has allowed non-metropolitan areas to catch up in Portugal, which is a good thing, lowering the level of productivity inequality across regions, and as a result, lowering the level of regional income inequality. Second challenge, the demographic challenge that was mentioned. Portugal is one of the OECD countries facing the largest population decline. Its population has been shrinking since its peak of 10.7 million in 2009 and is projected to be less than 9 million by 2050. These trends are very difficult to turn around, as Peter mentioned, and focusing on productivity is therefore crucial. Non-urban areas, mostly in the inner part of the country, are bearing in Portugal the brunt of this decline, while urban areas have witnessed relative population growth, even if it was modest. So there is a kind of unequal geography of population decline in Portugal, which is different from what we observe in countries like Lithuania and Latvia, for example, where it's more uniform in the country. So this could impact regional inequalities in the future in Portugal. The third challenge relates to how job opportunities are highly concentrated in urban areas. This is the case in most of OECD countries. Portugal is not an exception. The Portuguese population is unevenly distributed across regions. If we compare to other OECD countries, it has the 5th most unevenly distributed country population among OECD countries shown on this slide. This correlates, of course, with education and job opportunities. Across the OECD, the tertiary educated, those with a higher education degree, increasingly concentrate in city. And compared to a decade earlier, this city-rural gap has increased in almost all OECD countries, but Portugal, along with the Slovak Republic and Hungary, has registered the largest increase of this gap, 10 percentage points. So this is not problematic in itself, given the need for Portuguese large cities to catch up vis-à-vis their peers, but it could still raise issues for inner regions, especially in light with the demography challenges that I mentioned before. So let's now have a brief look at some of the policy options to make the most of the territorial development agenda, drawing on the experience from OECD countries. First, I would like to underline that addressing inequalities should be about stimulating regional productivity catching up in all types of region, rather than fighting against agglomeration. For Portugal, this means supporting both inner and metropolitan regions to enhance the productivity potential of the country as a whole. In this sense, place-based policies complement the traditional macro-structural policies. Let me also underline that there is no silver bullet to tackle these issues. Otherwise, we would not be in this room discussing this if it was easy to fix. So these challenges require tackling sequenced complementary actions across what we have identified as 5 priorities in the outlook to strengthen place-sensitive policies. So you can see these 5 pillars on the slide. Equitable access to quality public services and infrastructure, boosting productivity in our regions, providing quality job opportunities in regional labor markets, improving multi-level governance systems, and strengthening central and subnational strategic, institutional, and fiscal capacity. In all OECD countries, a mix of these 5 pillars is needed. But the balance, the mix, will really depend on each country, each region-specific context. For example, a country like the United States has a much greater focus on the first pillar, equitable access to infrastructure. So let me give a few maybe concrete examples, because these recommendations are quite high level. So concretely, ensuring equitable access to quality public services means, for example, providing access to different types of services in a single location for underserved communities in rural or remote regions. We have interesting examples from Japan, from France, on how they have been trying to do that in recent years. In Japan, which is facing very acute demographic challenges, as you know, they have put in place policy which is called the Small Stations Initiative, which creates basic service hubs to help sustain rural communities around small multifunctional cores. When it comes to boosting new development opportunities in all types of regions, including inner regions, there are opportunities arising, of course, from the green and digital transition and the new global environment. We all know that the recent shocks have accelerated the energy transition and the focus on renewable energy, especially in rural regions. This is providing massive opportunities for some rural regions in the OECD. And in Portugal, rural regions are well positioned to benefit from the green transition as the country is already a leader in renewable energy compared to the OECD perspective. In 2021, the percentage of renewable energies in the total energy supply in Portugal was 29% compared to 12% on average for the OECD. The global environment has considerably changed, and it started before COVID, with the trade restrictions increasing throughout the last decade due to the tensions with China. But it creates, of course, a number of very, very important challenges, but also some opportunities for certain regions. The revival of industrial policy in OECD countries and the new strategic alliances, reshoring or nearshoring, could boost economic activity and help reindustrialize certain regions. Given Portugal's focus on higher education, innovation, and building entrepreneur-friendly ecosystem, it looks like Portuguese regions could be well positioned to host a number of smart manufacturing activities in the coming years. So the last focus, the difficult one, the focus on governance, multi-level governance, it's another way of untapping regional potential. In 2020, in the report that I mentioned on decentralization and regionalization in Portugal, we acknowledged that for Portugal, it was a priority to catch up with OECD levels of GDP per capita, and to do this, Portugal needed to boost the productivity of metropolitan regions, and Portugal needed to strengthen the role of regions. In this report, we presented several non-mutually exclusive potential paths for governance reforms in Portugal. One is to enhance intermunicipal cooperation. You all know very well that intermunicipal councils do exist in Portugal, but that their role remains limited as they only receive a fraction of local spending. Another option that we highlighted was to strengthen the regional level, notably by strengthening the CCDR, improving the coordination of deconcentrated central government services at the regional level. We also proposed an option of having the fully elected regional tier of government in this report. So these are options that we put at the table. But what is important to keep in mind is that they should not be at the expense of a strategic and monitoring role for the central government. Too often, decentralization reforms or multi-level governance reforms are seen as a kind of zero-sum game in which one level gains and the other loses. But that's not the right approach. The strengthening of subnational capacities should always go hand in hand with the reinforcement of the center, of the national capacities, notably to provide an integrated strategy for regional development, tools for coordination, tools for monitoring some national strategies, and align priority. This is crucial today as we deal with very, very complex policy priorities at all levels. So this was a quick snapshot of the trends in the OECD and in Portugal. The next regional outlook that will be released this summer will provide a lot more detail. We will also release a report on regional attractiveness, which include case studies on Portugal on the 5th of July. And next week in the OECD Regional Development Policy Committee, we will submit for approval by all OECD countries the first OECD standards on regional development policy, which encapsulates some of the points that I mentioned in this presentation. Thank you very much. Obrigada.
Thank you very much, Dorothee. I will open the floor for a debate while you thinking on raising your hands. I think it was quite clear that this topic matters on international framework, global perspective, European, OECD. The second, I think it's quite clear that the evolution of Portugal over the last 2 decades is atypical at European level, but also at the OECD level. However, and this is related with the model, with our territorial model, with evolutions, at the afternoon session, we'll have a time for in-depth discussion on the Portuguese case, on the indicators. I will present a teaser for this afternoon because we are assessing convergence on the basis of GDP, PPS per capita. So I think it's quite relevant to have an in-depth analysis on what is the role of GDP, what is the role of PPS, what is the role of per capita. Because some charts presented this morning give an hint on some kinds of convergence, but we'll leave for this afternoon. However, the challenges, I think, are quite similar for Portuguese region and the others, and that's why this exchange of ideas matters. The challenge regarding the competitiveness, quite clear that for Portugal that should mean innovation and human capital, where you need to have a strong push on that topic. The demographic challenges, notably I think, and this is quite kind of a joke with the minister, we have to use the English term shrinking because it's much more accepted in Portugal than, I don't know what is the term, but to assume that the population in Europe will not increase, and not only for Portugal, even for Europe, the only way to grow is by productivity. So, but that means a different approach in policy terms. So I'm close to the end of my bridge between this presentation and your questions to start the debate. Who wants to Minister, please, micro, where we have the micro. Okay. Em português, em inglês, como preferirem, porque há tradução.
Vou falar em português?
Sim.
Bom dia, muito obrigada pelas vossas apresentações. Eu tenho uma pergunta para cada um dos oradores, embora considere que as 3 apresentações se tenham complementado. Portanto, concluindo, nós verificamos que as regiões portuguesas convergem entre si, basicamente porque as áreas metropolitanas diminuíram ou não cresceram como as suas homólogas no resto da Europa e, portanto, internamente convergimos, externamente não convergimos. Não gostaria de usar a palavra divergência porque parece-me que os indicadores não apontam para divergência. Tenho uma questão que, no que toca à armadilha, o Andrés falou da armadilha, da importância de uma análise dinâmica. Nós verificamos que temos o problema da armadilha do desenvolvimento em todos os países, incluindo em todos os países. Portanto, é uma constatação de que todos os países têm regiões a sofrer com a armadilha do desenvolvimento. É mais preocupante quando verificamos que essa armadilha, em termos de risco, é maior nas regiões que tradicionalmente são regiões mais dinâmicas. E, portanto, isso coloca-nos, em termos de política pública, desafios, a palavra que todos usamos, muito grandes. E, portanto, em termos de política pública, quais seriam as suas recomendações, Andrés? Uma vez que nós temos aqui uma preocupação em termos de coesão territorial, eu pessoalmente defendo muitas das vezes de que a dinâmica ou a resolução de problemas destas regiões mais desenvolvidas está no aproveitamento do potencial de outras regiões, no caso de Portugal, que até verificamos que têm um risco no interior menos elevado de armadilha. E hoje, com novas formas de organização do trabalho hoje, com novas tendências que as famílias têm, de vivência, e, portanto, assegurando o que a Dorothy referiu, a qualidade dos serviços, a conectividade digital, assegurando que esses territórios do interior, no fundo, têm que ter os serviços que têm as outras geografias mais desenvolvidas, mas não deixando de ter a qualidade que têm. E, portanto, a minha pergunta é para os três que fizeram a análise, mas importa muito também ouvir a vossa questão em termos de política pública. E depois, Peter, agradecendo muito o relatório que temos também deixou-nos aqui uma mensagem que eu defendo muito e que esta pergunta é para todos um pouco. A análise com base no PIB per capita é redutora. Ela é importante, obviamente, mas como um elemento de análise. E quando nos dizem que nós devemos ter uma análise que é sensível às regiões, às características das regiões, nós não podemos ignorar que no nosso país nós temos regiões onde há uma grande informalidade e, portanto, regiões muito resilientes. Isso é demonstrado na sua resiliência aos choques externos. Portanto, há muito da qualidade de vida, há muito do que representa uma economia informal, que não são transações de mercado e que não são capturadas pelo PIB per capita, mas depois podem ser capturadas por outras variáveis com um índice mais complexo. E, portanto, quero saber a vossa opinião, gostava muito de saber a vossa opinião, e enquanto Ministra da Coesão Territorial, é com muita frustração que eu vejo que nós não conseguimos desenvolver um indicador de coesão territorial, ou seja, nas suas diferentes dimensões. Nós vamos tendo aproximações, mas a política de coesão é a política talvez mais antiga da Europa e que revelou ser uma política moderna e flexível na pandemia e, portanto, que revelou ser uma política muito atual e que revela no nosso país que é importante o seu aproveitamento e muito mais no período 2. Mas nós temos que monitorizar, nós temos que fazer política não com base em percepções, mas com base em dados. E o PIB per capita, para mim, é uma variável importante, obviamente, mas incompleta, tendo em conta as características da nossa região. Se nós conhecermos o modo de vida do norte de Portugal, ninguém acredita que o PIB per capita mede o nível de vida das pessoas do norte de Portugal. E, portanto, basta viver, basta ir. E, portanto, não estou a dizer aqui nada que não conheçam, porque conhecem o nosso país. Deixava estas observações e estas questões enquanto política, mas também enquanto estudiosa destas questões, e agradecendo muito, muito os vossos contributos.
Obrigado, Sra. Ministra. Vamos colecionar 2, 3 perguntas. Tenho aqui à direita, Tiago, não sei.
Muito bom dia. Eu começava por cumprimentar a Sra. Ministra da Coesão e vou voltar ao seu último ponto, cumprimentar a AD&C pelo fantástico fórum que aqui organiza e também todas as autoridades de gestão, CCDRs aqui presentes, comunidades intermunicipais. E começo pela mensagem que a Comissária Elisa Ferreira nos deixou, em que fala claramente da região do Alentejo como uma região em que existe, ao mesmo tempo, uma perda de população, mas também uma fraca atração de talento, ou retenção e atração de talentos. E, por isso, o desenho da política pública tem que ser cada vez mais adequado àquilo que é este enorme desafio que temos na região Alentejo, como nas restantes regiões a nível nacional. Mas ligando e agradecendo muito as 3 intervenções e apresentações que nos deixaram, gostava de ligar a primeira à segunda apresentação e dizer que aquilo que já observamos nos números mais recentes é que, quando olhamos para as NUTS 3, já sentimos que existem dinâmicas e velocidades muito diferentes, que depois impactam nos processos de desenvolvimento e também nas dinâmicas demográficas. E, por isso, quando nós comparamos as opções de política, e o Duarte já acabou por referir isso. As opções de política deste período de programação, sentimos que existe uma quase semelhança naquilo que é o perfil de investimento das opções políticas de cada um dos programas. Mas, se formos às abordagens territoriais, e aproveito que está aqui ao meu lado também um presidente de uma comunidade intermunicipal, possivelmente daqui a um ano vamos conseguir medir isso, é nesta governança multinível, nas abordagens territoriais, que nós podemos ganhar muito daquilo que é a coerência, mas também a equidade no crescimento e na competitividade em cada uma das regiões. No caso do Alentejo, nós vemos claramente o Alentejo litoral começar a convergir e sentimos que outras regiões ainda não acompanham esse processo. E por isso é nesta fase absolutamente decisiva em que nós vamos ter que perceber que cada uma das sub-regiões, e esta é uma fase tremendamente decisiva, vai ter que fazer coisas diferentes, vai ter que ter abordagens diferentes para que consigamos convergir naquilo que é o processo de desenvolvimento regional. E acabava reforçando também uma mensagem com a qual concordo em absoluto. Nós estamos, a nível nacional, com um processo de descentralização que está a atingir agora a sua velocidade de cruzeiro, e a mensagem que a Ministra da Coesão nos deixou em relação ao PIB é absolutamente aquilo que sentimos também no território. Aliás, eu aprendi a fórmula do PIB nesta mesma universidade, na disciplina de macroeconomia, mas é uma medida que nos mostra cada vez menos. É uma medida que já está muito desajustada daquilo que é a realidade, mas também as perspectivas de desenvolvimento dos Estados-membros e de cada um dos territórios. Por isso vamos ter que lhe introduzir novas variáveis para que respondam e para que do lado da política pública também possa haver uma adequação. Agradecer muito as apresentações e era também este contributo que deixava. Muito obrigado.
Obrigado. Aqui ao meio. Teresa. E depois passamos a bola para cá.
Ouve-se bem. Muito bom dia, Sra. Ministra, e todos os painel e todos os presentes. Eu só queria acrescentar aqui também uma pergunta que, porventura, tem, na vossa componente de apresentações que aqui trouxeram, alguma reação. Isto é evidente que tudo o que se passa na região de Lisboa e que hoje aqui foi apresentado não nos satisfaz, não entendemos que esta armadilha que a região desenvolvida de Portugal tem para ultrapassar, vê-se que não é um desafio fácil, face até ao panorama europeu que aqui observamos, mas, efetivamente, enquanto responsável, sinto um desafio enorme para o poder ultrapassar. E a minha pergunta é a seguinte: nós, neste quadro em que nos preparamos para o futuro, tivemos da parte da região de Setúbal, portanto, tivemos na região de Lisboa uma sub-região que, de uma forma muito intensa, veio apresentar as questões que impediam o seu desenvolvimento. E, portanto, a solução que o país encontrou e que o Governo encontrou foi que, no futuro, teremos 2 NUTS 2 na região de Lisboa e isso, porventura, vem dar uma resposta positiva às questões que aqui foram levantadas. Isto é, uma região desenvolvida que vai ter 2 estratégias distintas e que pode vir trazer um desenvolvimento acrescido a uma sub-região que nitidamente estava desvalorizada num contexto de abordagem geral. E, portanto, isto pode ser uma resposta que pode trazer uma diferenciação no futuro. E, portanto, eu gostava de ouvir também a vossa posição. Obrigada.
Obrigado, Teresa. Passamos para este lado do palco e depois voltamos a abrir mais uma ronda de questões. Temos aqui várias questões que a Ministra colocou, que os nossos colegas das CCDRs, das autoridades, não colocaram, mas eu não resisto a sublinhar a que o Tiago colocou, que é... Bom, mas esta medida não é exatamente a que nos serve. Eu sei que vocês já responderam muitas vezes a essa pergunta. Andrés, começaria por aqui, porque sei que essa é a pergunta mais feita quando se fazem estes mapas. beyond GDP per capita, is there a way, or I think it's a second step? First, we need to understand the data.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the questions. So we need to focus just on GDP per capita. We've been promoting the idea that we need to go beyond GDP per capita. We need to keep GDP per capita, and we need to look into other dimensions. When we were proposing the whole idea of the development trap, we looked into these three dimensions, GDP per capita, productivity, and employment. And I think they are complemented, because you can have growth in GDP per capita without growth in employment. You can have growth in employment without growth in productivity. And you can have growth, well, there's virtually no growth in productivity anywhere in Europe, or very few places. So there's a need. We also discussed the idea, do we include population change, which is important for places like Alentejo, much less for the case of Lisbon. And that was a discussion. The idea is, do we have a much more complex indicator? Of course, more complexity also undermines the efficiency of a policy. So in the end, we decided to keep the development trap on just three simple economic indicators. So clearly, yes, there's a need, and in the discussions that we're having in the group, we're going beyond, because we're focusing on not just economic growth in those three dimensions, but we're also focusing on the idea of opportunities. What are the opportunities to have talent, or to harness, as Commissioner Ferreira was saying, the talent that is, whether it is in Alentejo or in Lisbon or in Trás-os-Montes or in the Algarve, that can be actually moved, and how can you create the opportunities for that talent to be retained in the places where that talent can make the most impact. Having said that, I'm going to be provocative. And this is something that was highlighted by one of the experts that came to our meetings. GDP per capita is highly related to all other indicators. So GDP per capita is highly connected to life expectancy, is highly connected to well-being, is highly connected to access to basic services. So one doesn't come without the other. We can introduce a lot of other indicators, but if we introduce a lot of other indicators, sometimes we might lose one of the main indicators. So we need to have a policy that is focused on a limited number of indicators. The more complex question is, how do we integrate, as the Minister was saying, the whole dimension of the underground economy? And that is a big issue. I would say that the presence of underground economy, as has been highlighted by people that look at it, is a symptom of precariousness. No one wants to be in an underground economy. Of course, the underground economy can serve to actually mask what is a decline. The North is not declining as much as it is because there's a higher underground economy, or there should be a higher underground economy, because we don't know exactly, after all, the economy is underground, than what it should be. But in most developed economies, what we need to do is to make sure that we create the incentives and the mechanisms to make sure that people working in, let's say, the underground sector, in the black economy, in this type of economy, have got the opportunity to surface that sort of economic activity, because it does not just, in the long run, improve the quality of workers and of the people that are in in those sectors that are affected, but it also enhances the overall potential of the economy, for that economy to grow.
Thank you, Andres. Peter, do you want to come in on the questions?
Yes, I mean, I think that, when you are trying to go on a journey, you need a compass. Because you need to be going in the right direction. And I think our view is that GDP gives you that compass. But it shouldn't be the only element. And I think that, there are two questions about the GDP for cohesion policy. The question is the role that GDP plays in the methodology for allocating the funds. Yeah. And the second is how you develop interventions to address different levels of development. Now, on the first, I think Andres's argument is very strong because it's one of the few indicators that we have. We can add other indicators there are other indicators in the allocation methodology, but it is something which commands relative consensus on what it is. So I think for that reason, plus the other reason that the identity of our policy is about the least or the less developed. Even if we start talking about development traps, I think our policy will always be about the less developed. And the best indicator for identifying the less developed remains GDP. On the other hand, when we come to what we're doing with our money and how we achieve things, I think that we have to be much broader to adapt things to different circumstances. I agree once again with Andres that the informal economy is a type of trap because it provides you a kind of a short-term solution, but it doesn't give public authority the resources to provide public services, it doesn't pay for people's pensions, and all of this. So it's a sticking plaster. It's not a solution. But what I wanted to say in relation to this is that we talked about the regional competitiveness index and the mismatch. But there are other indicators for Portugal where there are significant mismatches with GDP. So I give an example, a couple of examples to provoke slightly Andres. So quality of institutions. Portugal performs. If you compare it to faster-growing regions in Central Eastern Europe, there is no comparison. Ease of doing business. We have a regional ease of, and we could continue. So I think in order to understand that, you have to really start digging with other indicators to try and work out what is going on, why these things are not, let's say, functioning as they can. And I think I stay with the analysis which I presented, which is that there are very big issues of innovation. Innovation, human capital at all levels, and human capital, as I suggested, becomes increasingly important in places which are demographically challenged. You either have to raise the capacity or you have to bring people in. There are no two choices. International linkages for a country like Portugal is really very, very important. And GDP will not help you with those. You have to. So I think I very much agree with you. But I think that the GDP will remain at the core of it. But we have to have a richer picture.
Thank you, Peter. Dorothy, you want to comment?
Yes, I would agree very much with what Andres and Peter have just said. And as I mentioned, at the OECD, we try to go beyond GDP per capita, even if it remains crucial, as was said, and kind of unavoidable for some analysis. But we really try to, for example, the sustainability dimension is not at all integrated in this GDP per capita. So the access to public services, etc. So we've developed at the OECD the well-being indicators, which include 11 dimensions. Duarte knows them very well because he was chairing the working party at that time. So these well-being indicators provide really a kind of comprehensive overview of each region's strengths and challenge on these 11 dimensions that go well beyond GDP per capita.
Sorry, if I can. Sure. I think the Minister has raised a very important point, is the idea, what do we do? In Portugal you have convergence, but you have the wrong type of convergence. So how do we address first the main problem of making sure that Portugal grows, and then that it has the right type of convergence, because not only Lisbon and Porto grow more than they have done in the past, but also that all other regions in the interior actually grow. And here I think it's remarkably important how much coincidence there was between Peter and Dorothea in their presentations. There are two types of problems. The first one is the structural problems that have been highlighted. And in the spider graphs that Peter had, what came out was human capital, was innovation, which were the sort of things that Dorothée highlighted in your 5 dimensions, which included human capital, included innovation, included 2 dimensions of institutions, overall institutional quality, and included also multi-level governance, the whole governance issue. Having said that, the question is, how do you adapt them to specific regions? And I would highlight that perhaps in the human capital dimension, this is where most can be done. Why? Because Portugal has been a country that until recently had a significant gap in formal education, so a lot of people dropping out, and that probably there has been a significant mismatch between educational supply and labor demand, with very little on-the-job training, which is not just a problem exclusive to Portugal, it's a problem exclusive to many countries across the whole of Europe. And much more can be done, but this is the horizontal sort of intervention that needs to be done in different ways, in different forms across the whole of Portugal. Then the question comes is, what can we do in Lisbon and what can we do in Alentejo in order to make sure that both grow and in the end you end up with higher growth and higher convergence? And here's where there's more scope for differentiation. This is a time in which we have realized in Europe that we can use industrial policy, we can use state aid in much more creative ways. And there is where we can even differentiate within regions. So can we do the same thing in Lisbon than we do in Setúbal? You have to decide, you have to make bets. We have the next generation funds, we have national funds available to make sure. So how do we transform our regions in order to make sure that the regions grow on the basis of what we already have, but not to remain where we are, to transform ourselves in a radical way. And that's where there's a need to make bets, deciding these are the sectors that we have, how can we improve the complexity of those sectors, how can we improve the technology component of those sectors, how can we improve, and this I think is very, very important, the connectivity of our sectors to markets, but when you connect to markets, you connect to innovation, you connect to new ideas, and at the same time, how can we diversify to related sectors to make sure that we start from what we have and little by little we innovate until we end up in other sectors that are not radically different from what we have, but are far more technologically advanced and far more competitiveness, allowing us to actually go up in the competitiveness index that you're producing in the European Union.
That's how smart specialization works. I think we have really a homework to do in order to assess this mismatch. Again, when you think on this conversation, the support on the Portugal 2020 and even the SRF, Portugal have a strong focus on human capital because it needs to fulfill a historical gap, and on innovation. And then there are some interesting results again, some interesting intermediate results. We achieve a share of exports regarding to GDP of 50%, which in Portugal is really relevant because historically it's not so important. But then how to translate in GDP, it is a question of time. It is a question of chicken and eggs, for instance, on human capital, because we overcome the gaps in human capital, but then we don't have our economic profile hiring these new talents that we are producing, and from time to time we are in this global market of talent, let's call it like that. So, and this is really can be solved really in the place-based model for that, but that requires, and that's my question, I enter in the question mode, that's my question to Peter, that requires to think on territorial scope or territorial lens, also at a European semester. You touch upon this a relevant topic. We had several discussions over the last years on how is it possible to have a more territorial approach in the European Union without putting a territorial scope in European semester, because nowadays it's the guidance for not only RRP, cohesion. Do you think that we are in a way to improve that territorial scope?
We are trying. I mean, you will see in the European, I mean, you've seen the draft country report. I mean, we have, I speak now, it's a bit unfair because only some people have seen the document in the room. But we have a dedicated section on territorial disparities in the form of an annex. Also, I think the Portuguese country report, in the main part of the report, actually starts talking about disparities. So we have a foot in the door. We have a foot in the door on this, and it's something we want to reinforce in the future. And I think that is a first step. And I think, you know, the question, and this is something which we are also working on, is to make people aware that cohesion is important for the European growth model. That without cohesion, and I use here the language of Andrés, there is lost potential. There is lost potential. Let's say a low female participation rate is a lost economic potential. It's a lost set of opportunities for women. High unemployment rates of young people, it's the same thing. It's the thing. There is a question of mobilizing the full economic potential, and this is something which we are trying to push, and I think we make some progress. Another thing which is related to this, and it's an idea which was launched by my commissioner, is this notion of do no harm to cohesion in other policies, because I mean, this applies at a national level. I mentioned this yesterday evening, but I say it now publicly, is that if you look at Andrés's map of development traps and you look at France, this is not just a question of chance. This is also the result of 200 years of national policies, which have focused on a very, very centralized model. The same thing goes in the United Kingdom. You have a choice there to have a very, very centralized model. In the case of Germany, there is a choice to have a more decentralized model. These are clear policy choices, and the same thing applies at the European level. That there are policies which have, let's say, a central effect. So we're trying to introduce this idea that we have to have a reflection in other EU policies. And I think we intend to start with research.
Thank you, Peter. To conclude, Dorothée, I will leave the question on French for our lunch conversation. My question is not about that. You touch upon the inequality, income inequality within regions. So we are talking about inequality in GDP per capita across regions, net 2, net 3. But the question is, and probably related to the geography of discontents, to the idea of fairness, or to the issue of fairness. This question of income inequality within regions, is it a topic on your research, on your debate?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's at the core, I would say, of what we have analyzed in this next regional outlook. And it's true that we need to analyze at the level of small regions, TL3, net 3. The level of large region, net 2, TL2, does not allow to have the right level of understanding, in particular among urban and rural areas. And in many countries, we should not caricature, because it's not the case everywhere, not at all. But for example, in the United States, it's really at this level, urban-rural, that we see the massive divides, which can only be analyzed again at this level of TL3 within a region. So yes, we are trying to really focus our analysis on this level now, and to focus a bit less on the large regions. Yeah.
Alguma última questão? Ali. Temos a última questão lá em cima. É o fala agora ou calça? Obrigado.
Olá, bom dia. O meu nome é Josué Caldeira. Bom, eu vou falar em português, é mais fácil. Estou mais calmo e creio que mais confiante naquilo que quero colocar. Eu parto do título do seminário, Processos de convergência regional, perspetiva internacional. E eu quero vos dizer o seguinte, nestas discussões há um texto que está sempre na minha cabeça, que eu não me consigo desligar. Foi um texto escrito em 1979 por uma geógrafa, Doreen Massey, cujo título era In what sense a regional problem? Em que sentido os problemas regionais são problemas das regiões? Esta questão eu acho que se mantém hoje atual. A Doreen Massey, quando escreveu este artigo, foi o prefácio, digamos assim, do seu livro maior, que era as Spatial Divisions of Labour, as divisões espaciais do trabalho. Este é o primeiro ponto. E eu creio que nós estamos a fugir a este debate. E volto a insistir, a pergunta que a Doreen Massey fazia, em que sentido os problemas regionais são problemas das regiões, permanece. Primeiro ponto. Segundo ponto, os mapas que o Andrés ali colocou. Os mapas da armadilha do desenvolvimento em todas as regiões da Europa entre 2000 e 2019. Das imagens que foram projetadas, eu identifico dois grupos de regiões, excluindo as regiões de leste, da Europa de leste. Identifico dois grupos de regiões. Regiões ganhadoras e regiões perdedoras. São regiões ganhadoras a periferia de Paris e uma parte significativa das regiões francesas e uma parte muito significativa do sul da Europa. Itália, Grécia, muitas regiões de Espanha e de Portugal. Para mim, não é coincidência que estes mapas, de 2000 a 2019, refletem uma Europa pós-euro. E eu voltava novamente à questão de Doreen Massey. E o desafio que ela colocava era ver os problemas regionais numa perspectiva geográfica mais ampla. E os problemas regionais que ela via era como manifestações de dinâmicas e de processos de geografia mais ampla. E voltava à mesma pergunta que a Doreen Massey coloca. Neste contexto, em que sentido é que os problemas das nossas regiões são problemas de desenvolvimento das nossas regiões? E se não há aqui problemas ligados diretamente ao próprio modelo de desenvolvimento da Europa? O Peter acabou de dizer uma frase que me parece importante. A política de coesão é importante para o modelo de crescimento da Europa. Eu acho que devemos reverter a pergunta. O modelo de crescimento da Europa é relevante para uma política de coesão europeia? Obrigado.
Obrigado. Agora a última, depois da última, Joaquim. E depois fechamos, porque temos que cumprir.
Não, quer dizer, não é bem uma pergunta, é só para dar uma nuance no que o Andrés disse sobre a correlação entre o PIB per capita e os outros indicadores de desenvolvimento. Tu tens razão, a correlação é fortíssima em termos de níveis. Mas quando se olha para o crescimento dos diferentes indicadores, a correlação é muito mais baixa e sabe perfeitamente que com um certo nível de desenvolvimento até não há correlação entre o aumento do PIB per capita e outros indicadores, outras dimensões de desenvolvimento. Portanto, tem que se ter cuidado um bocadinho com essa diferença entre os níveis e as taxas de crescimento.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. Just start with Joaquim's point. You're absolutely right. I was talking about levels, and that was mainly what Michael Silva was highlighting in terms of levels of growth and changes is different. But I'm going to go back to the question of about Doreen Massey, and I'm glad that you mentioned Doreen Massey, who was a very dear friend that was actually changed the way we look at economic geography for many times. There are two parts of the question. The first is, do we have a model of growth in Europe? And, well, many academics from economics, but also from geography, have tried to highlight that there are some models. And the dominant model was one of big cities steaming ahead, the rest of the country doing worse. So it's a model that favors the most dynamic agglomeration, density, big cities, whereas medium-sized cities, towns, small cities, towns, and rural areas doing badly. I think that both in Peter's presentation, but especially in Dorothea's presentation, she did the analysis, and there's not such model. You have places in the OECD and in Europe where the big cities are doing very well, and divergence as a result is growing. But you also have other places that are steaming ahead and where big cities are not the most dynamic. So the contrast between some Central and Eastern European countries and, for example, Germany, and vice versa with places that are declining. You had the worst sort of situation, which is Italy's, in which you don't grow and then you polarize. You have the case of Portugal or Spain, where you don't polarize, but you don't grow either, or Greece for that respect. So I'm wondering, is there a model? And have we been sold different types of models, pitching big cities versus small cities, richer areas versus poorer areas, when in reality, and I think Peter highlighted this very well, what we have is a very high complexity of models. Having said that, then I go back to your question, in which way, or Doreen Massey's question, in which way a regional problem? So we have a system, an economic system, and a political system that is generating very different levels of development at regional level, in which some regions are steaming ahead, some others are falling into this armadillo, I love the word, this trap.
Much more complex than trap.
I think it's much more interesting. So this armadillo de desenvolvimento. And so you end up in that situation whereby you're stuck. But the question is, yes, and Doreen Massey was right in that this reflects an economic and a political system. But what Doreen Massey didn't envisage is that this is creating a revenge of these regions into the political and economic system. Just to give you an idea, the places where we have had the biggest problem of development traps that you mentioned, Greece, Italy, and France, although be it in France concentrated in particular areas of the country, are the places where the political system has completely exploded in Europe. It hasn't in Germany. But in France, the two main parties that dominated post-war France for 40 years, in the last presidential election, achieved the grand total of 7% of the vote. 7%. In Italy, they had disappeared completely. And in Greece, there has been some... So this is something that we need to take into account, that long-term periods of economic development, of lack of economic development, long-term periods of being in a trap, generate massive discontent that then gets translated into political unrest, options or votes for extreme parties that in turn undermine, in the long run, the potential for economic development and the well-being of the citizens in the future.
Thank you very much to our guests. Muito obrigado a todos vocês. Merecida.